Welcome to the Eureka Moment.
Laurie, thanks for being here. So Laurie, Gery, and I go way back. This is not our first foray into doing a podcast together. And I'm so glad you could be here today because I know it's not a little thing for you to make your way to Boston.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So
I'm happy to.
Appreciate it. And very appreciative of you being a faculty member and helping out with the IBE. It's a great session. Everybody asked a lot of questions. And
yeah, it was a really energizing session. I was surprised because after lunch is a tricky time slot.
Yeah, and it's a good group. It's just a really good group.
Yeah.
But so, what I think would be great if you could talk a little bit about sort of, what you're doing now and how you got there. You're a senior person in a big pharmaceutical company, and especially a lot of women are curious as to how do you, what was the path you took to get there? So a little bit of that. And we've talked about this before, but I think it would be good to repeat a little of that. And then also talking a little bit about moving into how you balance family and work. And we were just talking about that. So, maybe share a little bit of like what's gone into that. And I think too, what I've always admired is that you admit there's no perfect answer. And,
right.
Some days you're good at one thing and not at the other. Right?
Yeah. If someone has a perfect answer, I'm all ears. So yeah, I don't think I've had the most direct path, right? I, at a very basic level, was interested in science and went to school for that. I have a BS in medical technology, and I actually started in healthcare, right? I was really interested in the healthcare arena. I started working in a clinical lab, and found myself into industry by way of quality, right? Mm-hmm. So again, kind of looking at quality standards, quality assurance, and through getting into industry, got really interested in the business side of things. And that led to an MBA, and that led to taking on more commercial roles. And I think everybody wants to hear that it was very well planned and, meticulous move from one role to the other, but that's not exactly how it played out. I always tell people it's a lot of legwork and a little bit of luck. I think as you're going through your career journey, so I've had a bunch of different roles and have been fortunate enough to have a wide variety of experiences, I think, that let me hone into when I was kind of at the director level of where do I really want to focus? What do I really want to do with my life? And that allowed me to really start to think more about what am I going to learn in this job? What skills am I going to acquire in this job? And what am I really going to like about this job versus I think sometimes early in your career, you're so focused on the level and the promotion and, kind of, is that a good move? I always hear that. People always ask me that question. Is this a good move? And it's like, well, a good move in what way? A good move in that you're going to learn something, a good move in that you're going to make more money, So I think when I started out, the world was a whole lot more black and white. I think as you look back at my curvy career path, I've very much taken advantage of all the gray that's there and hopped around a little bit, even sometimes laterally.
What chunks of your career? Because, I was thinking about, this idea of gaining experience. Mm-hmm. Because one of the things now I'm seeing that we're into this IB thing and we have alumni coming back is that the experience, they come back and they're more mature as people. They're more mature in their thinking. They've gotten beat up a little bit and they've made some mistakes, which you're going to do in everything in life. But what would you say were the major blocks of your sort of progression that really lent to sort of like that apprenticeship thing where you gained, it was like, oh, okay, that was a really good job to have because I think that's interesting to people too, because you're right. I know my career has been so eclectic, but I can point to blocks that were very instrumental in me being able to do the things I can do today.
Yeah. So I can think of two really good examples, and one I didn't appreciate until after it was done, and one I knew it going in. So I can talk a little bit about that. So early in my career, I worked for a company that was growing exponentially faster than the infrastructure. So I didn't realize it at the time, but it gave us the opportunity to wear many hats and get exposed to a lot of different things that if you just kind of went right into big company, you wouldn't necessarily have that experience. And at the time, I was early in my career. It was fun. It was a little bit chaotic at times. And I don't think at that point I realized how much I was learning about flexibility, about being able to pivot if the direction you're taking isn't correct, about the ability to make mistakes and how you manage making those mistakes. And those were all things that were very much a part of those roles, but I didn't realize until much, much later how better prepared I was when I got into a lot of higher level roles. So I think that's one block. I think the second block is when I very deliberately went outside of my comfort zone. I did an expat. I moved to a different country. I took on a role that was a global role. So prior to that, I'd had very P&L driven, very, here's your KPI. This is what success looks like. Success is mostly those numbers. So in terms of what does success look like? It was more of an ambiguous picture. It was something that had high expectation to be really instrumental in how the business was evolving, but it wasn't really well defined. And like I said, I went into it deliberately, knowing that I was going into a lot of ambiguity and a lot of upheaval, not just in my professional, but my personal life. And man, was it hard. And, but man, was I glad I did it at the end, because after that, I don't think anything seemed hard, right? I had conquered a number of things, both personally and professionally. And I think it really set me up for routinely being able to operate outside of my comfort zone.
So I'm going to phrase this a little differently than we had talked about it previously, which is I had a young woman that I was doing a feedback with, and her stability score is really low. So she's very stressed. Yeah. Right. And we sort of started teasing it out. She's got her PhD. She's starting a company. No, I take that back. This woman was actually in a big company. Okay. And she wants to think about starting a company or going with a startup. Okay. She's in a big company. And married. And I asked, I said, do you mind sharing? Are you thinking about at some point having a family? She said, absolutely. My husband and I want to have children, but we're waiting. Okay. So she's not, you can imagine she has her PhD. She's been working for years. So this is not like a 20-year-old we're talking about, right? Okay. If you're talking to that woman, what are some of the things that you think, because you're not going to tell her what to do. I know you well enough to say there's no, you do this or don't do that. But what are some of the questions that you might ask her that you think she needs to answer relative to that state of thinking that I want to have that family. I want to have children. Yeah. And I've been at this a while, but I'm waiting for the right time. Right.
Well, that's what I was going to say. I'm assuming you're going to say she's waiting for the right time. And I don't subscribe to the fact that there's a right time for anything. And I've had this form of a conversation, not having children, going back to school, going for the job, right? And I actually work with a lot of women on helping them define, where they're at. Because what I find sometimes is people have, and I actually call it living where you're at. I actually find sometimes that people are living so much in the aspiration of things and that they're not actively looking at where they're at to understand what modifications they need to make at that point and understanding what's truly important. And so I think on the onset, not knowing anything, right? Sometimes people say, yeah, I'd like to have a family because they think it's the correct answer. Okay. They think that's what people want to hear, right? Especially with women, right? The reality of that situation, I think that my first question would be, is that one of your top priorities? Or is that a nice to have, which I know sounds terrible to say about children.
No, it's because if you've waited for a reason.
Right. You've waited for a reason. And, maybe it's not for everybody, right? And everybody makes their own decisions. And because I find this a lot when people are going for jobs. It's like, well, why are you going for it? Well, it's almost like, well, I feel like I should, and it's like, well, who's telling you that you should? And is that something that's really important to you? And the reason why I say living where you're at is because if you're not really fully recognizing the circumstances of where you are, that is going to dramatically impact how successful you're going to be at the next step. And I'm going to give you a great example because I worked with someone who, when I first started working with her, told me that she had 2 little kids and her commute was killing her. She had almost a 2-hour commute with traffic every day, and she wasn't getting home until late. And she felt like she was rushed, and she was really looking for a job that was less of a commute. And that was, spending more time with her kids was all we talked about. And then about a month later, she told me she was applying for a higher level job at the company she was at. And I said, well, hang on here. What? Right. But if I don't go for this, right. And it was almost about the fear of missing out that was driving her decision to actually make her situation worse. Right. Because she's looking at taking on a job with additional responsibility, still has that almost 2-hour commute, arguably maybe even less time with her kids. And I said to her, is there any reason you think this is going to make you less miserable? Right? Because she was pretty miserable when we started to talk. And once we talked through it and thought about it, she had to get herself okay with, okay, I'm going to kind of put myself in a little bit of a holding pattern in terms of a senior level job if I'm going to stay at this company. And ideally, I'm going to find myself something that is more in line with where my life is right now. Nothing is forever. And that is, I think, the biggest blind spot. And I carried that for years, right? I viewed every decision I was making as, if I'm making this, I am making this from now until the end of time, right? Like there's no turning back. I can't change my mind. And, sometimes you have to do what you have to do then. And if you talk about kind of how do you balance everything, and there have been times when my career has been the top thing, right? And it's been the most important thing I've focused on. And there has been times when it has been dead last. And it's about doing that work yourself and being okay with it. And being able to communicate on that, I think, is the other thing that people struggle with.
It's great insight. And I think, and there's no necessarily wrong or right answer to that, right?
Yeah.
And it's hard to know when you've only talked to someone a couple times what's really behind, that answer. Yes, I want to have children, but I'm waiting for the right time.
Yeah.
Right. It's hard to know what's really behind all of that. Mm-hmm. Right. And oftentimes the stuff I do, I'm fortunate that people will eventually open up and tell you things that
you're very good at that.
You can see that they're stressed. You can see that they're sad. You can see that they're struggling, but you don't, I know it because the data sort of teases stuff out, but then you don't know all the reasons why. And then sometimes they tell you and you're like, oh, that's a lot to take in. And I'm only hearing it. They're living it. Right. Mm-hmm. So it's a whole nother dynamic that comes into the relationship. And oftentimes that stuff plays out, but that's the human condition. Right. It's just the human condition. We all have that. We all have a myriad of challenges we have to navigate, some more than others. Right.
Yeah. The other issue that I did for a long time is, and I use this illustration, I called myself the queen of excuses, right? It's my if this, then that problem. Things are going to be better after this project's done. Things are going to be better after the school year ends. Things are going to be better after, I get my house painted. Pick a reason. But you have to take a look at when you're doing that too much, like I'm waiting for the right time. You have to really take a step back. I hear that, and I still loop into it, right? And I hear it in my head and I say, okay, I gotta, there's a lot that's, I'm not thinking about, talking about, acknowledging right now in my situation, because I see myself getting into that pattern of, okay, I'm waiting for some ball to drop at some point in the future thinking it's going to change things. But in reality, I have to start to take steps to change things now.
Yeah. I think what I've learned is there's always going to be challenges. It gets back to something my dad said years ago when, this is going back over 20 years ago. He said, you seem stressed. And I'm like, yeah, kids and, traveling. He said, the world rewards you for solving bigger problems. And you've been in search of bigger problems your whole life. Why are you surprised you found them?
Yeah.
And he said, if you can't enjoy navigating them and dealing with them, then don't take them on. Like, don't go looking for them.
Yeah.
And I thought about that. And I'm like, there is nothing in my life that's a challenge that I didn't put there. Right. Yeah. There are things that life throws at you, but you look at the things that I really worry about.
Yeah.
Right. Your wife, your kids, your business, your clients. I put all those things there.
Right.
I did that.
Yeah.
Right. And then I totally changed the way I looked at it. I looked at it and said, wait a minute, I'm blessed to have the opportunity to have all these things. And then I look at it, and I was just thinking about you today being here. I knew you had to arrange to be here, and you had to travel to be here, right? And you could say, it'll be better once I get past that.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay, that's one way to look at it. I look at it like, I'm blessed that you're here and we're doing this and we have this time. Because even just the short little conversation we had downstairs before we came up, we don't have enough of those.
Right. If I wasn't here, we wouldn't have had that conversation.
Right. And we're going to have more after this, right? But that having an opportunity to see you and talk to you, and it happens with everyone in my life, that you're like, why don't we do this more, not less? Yeah. So I look at it the opposite way, that I'll be a little sad when it's over because it'll be over.
Right. That's a really good way to look at it.
Yeah. So I think I was talking about this. I was doing a session yesterday. Our brains are meant to be in a negative state of emotion. It's a survival thing. Yeah. Right. So think about this. And this was the example I gave yesterday. You're going tomorrow on a vacation to the Caribbean. You, your husband, your 2 kids, no phone, no computer. There's no internet. You're going to the Caribbean tomorrow. Okay. When you wake up tomorrow morning to get on the plane, what's the first thing that goes through your head?
The stress of not being connected, to not knowing what's going on, and what if something goes wrong, and
And did I pack everything? And are the kids ready to go? And did they have their stuff? Yeah. And did my husband pack his stuff? And did I leave everything okay at work? And it's all negative emotion. Yeah. And you're going on a vacation. In a Caribbean, right? But that's my point, is like, your first thought when you wake up is not like, oh my God, this is it. This is the day. It's, oh my God, this is the day. All the stuff. Yeah. Right. And that's everything in our lives. Yeah. It's everything in our lives.
It's really interesting. Yeah.
Right.
It is.
So you have to think about putting yourself in that positive state of emotion. Right. Yeah. And that's with intent. That's not by accident. It doesn't happen by accident.
And you have to combat everybody around you who's not doing that. Right.
Or start to teach them how to do it. Yeah. Right. Like, if you teach a team to be right, that's part of what we're working on with your team, is teaching them how to develop relationships, trust people, right? Because I'm not going to ask you for help if I don't think I can trust you. Right. Right. And your team needs to work together. So, but if they trust each other, then they're not coming to you as a central point of solving problems or solving disagreements, or they're now solving those problems, and it elevates you to be more strategic.
Yeah. I always think about the workplace versus, and you know this, but my kids were always crazy into sports, right? So I spent a large amount of time around youth sports teams and have seen the different dynamics. And you're right. The teams that trust each other just play on a much different level than teams that have individual contributors, or teams that have individuals that are worried about themselves. And that it's very evident to watch teams play that are there for the team. And I struggle with why we struggle with it so much at work. And the greater good is always a better outcome than individual outcomes. But I think sometimes at work because you get paid to do a job, right? So everybody makes their own personal success a really big component of their job. And you don't want someone else to get credit for what you're doing, or, but in reality, when I look back over all the years, the best outcomes have been the team, right? If the team is achieving that outcome, it's always been much, much greater than anything that Laurie Gery could do on her own.
You're right. It's a group of people all working towards an end, it's going to be more successful. But here's why it doesn't happen.
Okay. I'm
Here's why
interested
it
in
doesn't
this
happen.
because it's hard.
No, it's
No?
because the leader is only focused on the performance and not focused on the preparation of those that are going to perform.
Yeah.
They're only worried about the performance. They don't ever look at the preparation and the well-being of the team. And teams can have great performances, but they can't be great teams unless they can perform all the time, not just some of the time.
Yeah.
So if all I ever do is look at the performance, then I never ever think about the development and maintenance and strengthening of the team that's necessary to perform over a period, over a season.
Yeah.
Right. I can have a great game.
Yeah.
You could see a great game and you can say, oh my God, that was so great. We want to see that every day.
Right.
But you've never ever put that team in a position to do it every day. And great performers will have those moments of excellence.
Yeah.
But they can't maintain them without
That's so interesting.
a leader that's there to develop them and make sure that the environment is constantly nurturing and supporting. Because think about it, you were an athlete.
Yeah.
You played sports at a high level. You get hurt. You always, as an athlete, are playing hurt. If you're an intense athlete, there's always something. Pulled muscle, a bad knee, this, that. I always played hurt, right? But I had enough time to get good enough to not let the team down.
Gotcha.
Right?
Yeah.
And that's what's failing in corporate America. They just want people to work and work and work. And then there's never any, the boss, how many bosses have you had that have ever stopped and said, are you okay? How are you doing? And is this a reasonable ask?
Yeah. I mean, I have, not everyone, but it is true. And hopefully my team will think differently that I operate that in the way that you just described, but it is very easy. You're right to get caught up in the performance and the objective. And what objective are you working toward? Right. If everybody has a different objective in their mind, then it's going to be a lot harder to feel successful. And like you said, to operate at a consistent level. So,
yeah, I look at, we're here for a relatively short period of time. Let's just say that God willing, we get 90 years. It's not going to be 90 productive years.
No.
Because you had those, being born up to the point where, right?
You weren't a productive baby? Is that what you're saying?
No, I don't even know if I was a productive teenager. But there's that period of growth that has to occur before you can contribute in any way to shape this society, right? And then there's that period of decline that we're all going to go through, right? And I just, before we came up here, I just learned that Laurie Halloran, who started Laurie Halloran Consulting, passed away.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Right. I didn't know. And one of her team members was here today presenting. Yeah. I Laurie has done a podcast with me not that long ago. I talked to her not that long ago, but she had a big life.
Yeah.
She had a big life. Like she had this extraordinary life, did it all on her own and built the company. And I think about, she didn't even get that 90 years. Yeah. And she left her mark. Sure. Right. But where I'm going with this is, I think a lot of people have to think about what's the point. What's the point, right? You got to spend that time. I put that slide up where you have sleep, work, and play. Yeah. So, and then you have 24 hours, and I have everybody try to spend that 24 hours. Yeah. Right. And there's tremendous imbalance. Like I think yesterday, I play 2 hours a day. I play 3 hours a day. I think there was one guy who was a European. He's like 9 hours a day. And I'm like, okay. But if all we're doing is working, at what point is it like it will be better? When? What's the answer to that question?
Yeah. And I think what is the motivation, right? Are you working just to work? Are you working to, at least it always was for me, right? Are you working to provide yourself a sense of recognition that, and why, right? To me, if I wasn't productive, what I deemed productive, right? Which was working, then I don't want to say failure because I don't think that's the right word, but I was lazy. If I sat down to watch a movie, well, that's what lazy people do, right? Like I could be doing other stuff. And I think early on in my career, I grossly underestimated the health impact that sleep had. Not just the health impact, right? Just the ability of the impact in my overall life, right? Like I think you can think better. I still to this day, like there's a limit to how much I can do from a mental perspective. Even if I just go outside and go for a 10-minute walk in the middle of the day, I am a much more reasonable, productive person in the afternoon than if you're going to ask me to start my day at 7, work through lunch. People, if you have that 4:00 meeting with me, you're not getting my best if that's the day that there is. And I think I failed to realize that for a very long time earlier in my career because I felt like the hustle and the push, and that was what everybody was doing, right? And that's where I kind of started to get into the idea of, well, what works for me, right? Like I get there's a whole bunch of people out there sleeping 5 hours a night. What works for me? And it's hard. It's really hard sometimes because sometimes you feel like you're really pushing against kind of the norms of society. And, so it's hard to be that person that's like, no, I got to get some sleep.
Well, so to that point, you and I live in a world that's supposedly driven by data. Mm-hmm. Data-driven decisions.
Yeah.
It's less than 1% of the human population can optimize cognitive and physical performance on less than 8 hours of sleep a night. Yeah. Less than 1% of the human population.
And that's a fact.
That's a fact. It's been studied. It's been documented. So anybody that says, and I was one of them, mm-hmm. for 20 years, I bragged about that I only needed 5 hours of sleep. And now I've read the literature. The performance that I was giving on 5 hours of sleep is not the quality of performance I would have given on 8. That's a fact.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, did I do a good job? Yeah, I did a great job because I nor the people around me didn't know what my potential would have been had I got 8 hours of sleep.
There you go.
We just didn't know.
Right.
Right. And I will never know. I can't go back and relive it and see if things would have been better and I had made better decisions and the mistakes I made, maybe I wouldn't have made them. Right. Yeah. But I can't go back. All I can do is know what I know now and make better decisions going forward. Right. Yeah. So that's number one. Number two, a simple thing like hydration. I brought up yesterday that, data, there's a data out there that shows that 1 to 2% dehydration has cognitive impairment. Okay. Yeah. That's documented. It's been studied. Right. Yeah. And so, Greg, who's sitting in the room. And so he Googled it and he sent me the studies, right? Just like, oh yeah, that was accurate. I'm like, okay. But my point is most people don't know that like drink enough water. Like, yeah, I know, but I just, I don't like water.
Right. Yeah. There's always an excuse.
There's an excuse. There's a reason. A little funny little anecdote. My dad used to see all these people like carrying the water bottles around. And he goes, when did everybody get so thirsty?
I know. My sister and I were just talking about this because, we were talking about drinking from the hose when we were kids. And I was like, I think it's because like we never had water anywhere else. We were like probably so thirsty that we were like, yeah, the hose, like, because you didn't, we weren't carrying water bottles around to elementary school, right? We drank those little cartons of milk, right? And so, yeah, it's funny. You say that about the data, and this is another kind of tangent story, but at lunch, we were talking about our data and our reports, and I'm sitting at a table with scientists, and they were telling me how they were quizzing you on like the CV of the data and what's the upper bound and what am I looking at here? Am I looking at the mean? And I said to them that I have done this assessment probably 7 times and I have never once questioned your graphs. I'm like having the conversation with them. I'm like, I'm glad to know they're scientifically sound when you said about the guy Googling it in the room. I'm like, I've never questioned Kurt, but that's so funny.
Well, a lot of it, what I say is, look, I said, put the data aside, because I've had a lot of conversations with this group, you can imagine, and you've experienced it.
Yeah.
And I said, put the data aside. I said, is it what you thought you were going to hear? And invariably you'll hear, no, not necessarily. As a matter of fact, one woman said it's contradictory to many assessments I've gone through. Mm-hmm. I said, but when you really think about it, do you think it's accurate?
Yep.
And then the emotion started, and she's like, yes.
100%.
She goes, and she said, and that's what's bothering me, that I've been through all these different programs where, and now you're teasing out stuff that is like getting to my core. and exposing like things that I haven't dealt with and I need to like examine and think about. She goes, and I don't know what to do with all this. I said, you don't have to decide right now.
Right.
But I said, you're now in a place where there's things you know that you didn't know. And there's a depth and there's an objective understanding of things that wasn't present before. And I said, so now you can make different decisions. If you want to change something, you now know what it is. You know, I say mechanism of action, why you're doing what you're doing and why that isn't working.
Yeah. And start to think about strategies to mitigate that, right? I think that's, listen, I've been through a bajillion assessments through my career, and the ability to action on them has been pretty minimal other than yours, right? You can tell me things about me. You can tell me what I am. You can, and I can communicate to people that I'm a direct person, right? And this is how I communicate. But to know what's going to move the needle forward holistically, and to also know where you started to fall into a little bit of trap. And that, we talked about this in my most recent time through the data, is that my avoidance score had gone way up, right? And I probably knew it, was probably ignoring it. But then seeing it on paper forced me to say, okay, I get it. I get what I'm doing here. And I, now have to take steps to correct that. So even seeing the evolution over subsequent assessments, I think is a huge benefit to know where you have to course correct.
Yeah. And you're not an avoider.
No.
Like you're anything but, right?
Right.
And then we look at things like stress and confidence and how that starts to play into all those other factors, right?
Yeah.
And so I think what's really cool about it is that you could look at it and say, there are behavioral traits that aren't where I want them to be right now.
Yeah.
Right. You and I would both look at our profiles now as we sit here today and say it's not, but there's no doubt that both of us are better people and in a better place than we were in 2009 when we met.
Right.
Right.
Was that when we met? Wow.
Yeah. 2009.
Ooh, that's a long time ago.
Yeah. So I look at it and I say, like, you are like the growth as a leader and a contributor, and just like even how you talk about your team, like everything. And I see it because I've been along that whole thing.
Yeah.
And it's extraordinary. It really is. And I look at that and say, the data just continues to take us back to say, what are the things we can continue to refine and improve upon? And life keeps throwing different challenges at us, right? The challenges you had back in 2009 are different than the ones you had today. And like you said, you had these experiences where you took your family and go over to Europe and you go do that right now. Yeah. Talk a little bit about, you said you got through that and you're like, okay, I dealt with so many personal and professional things. Yeah. But how would you say it affected your children and your husband, that experience? Would you say that they had the same benefit, or how would you say that experience affected them? So
my husband has a joke that he makes about it. He calls it his $1 million experience. He wouldn't trade it for $1 million. He wouldn't do it again for $1 million. So I think he was very much, and listen, his life changed 180 degrees, right? He quit his job for the opportunity and did it to support my career, and went into a world where if you looked at the expat community, it was predominantly the dads working and the moms were doing the kids, doing the house, doing everything. And so his life changed 180 degrees, rug pulled out from under him, right?
He was like Mr. Mom.
Yeah. And no one younger than, I don't know, whatever. You really just dated us. Anyway, the movie, everyone's Googling it now. But so I think he had a much different experience than the rest of us, right? Because he didn't have that anchor. I had work, the kids had school. So you had that anchor, and a lot of the other stuff was weird and challenging. And he was completely adrift and had to manage through that whole thing without an anchor. Now, if you talk to him, he'll joke about what was hard and what seemed traumatic at the time, and we'll laugh about stuff. So I think overall good experience. But I don't know if he would sign up for it again. If you were like, hey, we're just going to basically put you adrift in the center of the ocean and you're going to figure it out, I think he'd probably think twice about it, right? But again, he'd done it before. The kids have, I've just watched the kids over the years become such different people. And the number one benefit I always tell people that it was they had the opportunity to go to an international school, and it was so cross-cultural, and it just opened their eyes so wide beyond a world that they knew. And I don't think that you can ever put a value on that, right? Just the fact that there was kind of quote unquote no normal, right? You had a bunch of different kids with different cultural norms, different languages. It gave them the flexibility to figure out who they were, which I don't know that every kid gets, right? Because if
Most definitely don't here.
If you're with kids that are exactly like you, it's the same thing. It's basically the basic premise, right? If you're surrounded by people who think, act, talk exactly like you, how much opportunity do you have to really question if there's a different way to look at things, or if you want to look at things differently? So they've had that ability, over the years, and just kind of, I've watched kind of how they look at the world and how they approach things. And I think that experience was very, very instrumental in them being the people that they are today. Just from the way that they routinely put themselves into diverse environments, the confidence that they have, that I just, didn't always see all the time, with other kids that I was around. And, I even sometimes am a little bit taken aback at, no, that's not going to work for me. Right. Just the confidence in which they assess that and say that. And, in some instances, I would have never done that. I would have been like, oh, okay, well, maybe I should do that. Right. And they're like, no, I've thought about it. This isn't really where I want to head. I'm like, okay. Like, I think that for me was the biggest takeaway, I would say, from watching their experience doing it. And they were little, they were 6 and 9. So they both had different experiences. But they both look back on it with like just such fondness and such a big part of their lives, even now. And it's been a while now. Like we moved back to the US in 2015. So it's been a long time now, but it's still, it still comes up pretty regularly.
Well, I think, think about this. When was the first time you were ever out of the country? How old were you when you went out of the country?
Oh God. I mean, if you don't count Niagara Falls, when I think I was in
Canada's
high school.
Not really out of the country. Depending on where you were at Niagara Falls, you could have still been in the country.
I want to say like, it was like 2003. Like, I want to say I was in my 30s. Like,
I was in my 20s.
Yeah.
Right. The first time I ever did it.
Yeah.
My kids were in middle school.
Yeah.
Going to Nicaragua to, teach English.
Right.
They weren't just going to see it. They were going down with trips that Steph took them on. And Steph had that experience growing up. She had gone to Russia. She had gone to all over Europe.
Okay.
She had traveled a lot as a kid. So, but I grew up in Western Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
I had been on an airplane. At least I'd been to Florida and different places in the United States. But that really experiencing a different culture didn't happen for me until I was into my work career.
Yeah,
right?
me too.
Yeah,
for sure.
And so I think that affording our children an opportunity to see different cultures now, it broadens their thinking, their understanding. And we live in a different world now. Like the internet alone, you just think about how much information people have available to them.
Very true.
It's a great gift, but it's also a great curse because there's, it depends on what you choose to go find on the internet. That,
what your algorithm is.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit.
Sure.
Talk about, I thought it was interesting because you were presenting on sort of commercialization of pharmaceuticals and devices in your presentation. And we were talking, you were talking about the pharmacy benefit manager. And I think the average person has no clue how that prescription gets paid for.
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about that, because I think even though we live in an industry where it's important, I think the average person should know. Right. People are going and getting prescriptions. They have no idea sort of what's going on behind the scenes. And so maybe talk to that a little bit, because there was definitely a gentleman downstairs who wants to know if there's a podcast or a TED Talk.
Yeah, I think it's always a challenge, right? And I have this conversation with family and friends, right? Because at a very basic level, you get a prescription from your doctor, you go to the pharmacy. So it seems like, there's a tractor trailer parked outside the pharmacy and nobody really thinks about how the stuff gets to the pharmacy. And that's really that little box and that scope of the interaction is what everybody thinks about. And they don't think about the fact that there's many, many more players behind the scenes, right? And I think most people hopefully have insurance companies and they're not really sure what insurance companies are doing, right? They just know that they pay for some stuff. They might not pay for others. They might have different co-pays. And in reality, it's a pretty complex industry behind the scenes in terms of you have manufacturers, you have payers, you have wholesalers, and you have the pharmacy benefit managers, which, as the industry has evolved through managed care, right? And it used to be, doctor down the street, right? Well, doctor down the street might work for a large health system now, right? It's just the way that the industry has evolved. And you have these pharmacy benefit managers in kind of the middle between the manufacturers. And so they're contracting with the manufacturers. They're also contracting with the third-party payers, the insurance companies. And, we have.
So let's just say, like, so people know.
Yeah.
So the manufacturers would be like the Pfizers and the Modernas, which everyone knows because of COVID, right? And the Mercks. So those are the big pharmaceutical. They're the manufacturing the drug. Mm-hmm. But then like the pharmacy or like the Walgreens and the CVS's, right?
Yep.
But then there's this whole other layer, which are the sellers, easy for me to say. So that's like that would be like, what is it? It would be McKesson, Cardinal, right? Okay. Mm-hmm. So then you have those players, but then you have the pharmacy benefit managers. And right. This is the thing, like these are like the ones behind the curtain that nobody really knows about because they don't have trucks and vans and they don't have big storefronts, right? So talk about that a little bit.
Right. So I think if you think about it on the very basic level, right, if you're, everybody likes Amazon, right? And Amazon is in some cases stocking their own products. So they're buying products, right? It's in the Amazon warehouse and then you're buying it from Amazon, right? But Amazon has a contract behind the scenes, which how they have purchased that drug, right? Or that book, right? Well, yeah. Amazon started with books. So Amazon's got a contract with the book manufacturer and they're going to, try to get the best deal possible from the book manufacturer because they'd like to be able to make money when they sell you the book. Right. It's a kind of a similar concept, right? The pharmacy benefit manager is going to have a contract because they want to make sure that one, they're creating value for their company, right? Because they're a company. They're not a nonprofit, pharmacy benefit managers. They have a contract with the manufacturer so they can, get the drug from the manufacturer. I'm probably confusing this a little bit because they're not actually shipping the drug, but they have a contract.
All they do is negotiate.
All they do is negotiate the price.
They negotiate, right? They don't store it. They don't ship it. They don't pick it up. They don't do anything. They just represent a group of third-party payers, insurance companies or employers, right? And they represent them and they say, we will get you the best price. And for that, we're going to take a percentage out of that transaction that we're not going to tell you what would take.
Correct. So then you get to the other side, which is their contract with the third-party payer. So they're going to say, listen, I'm going to make a deal with you to cover this drug that I'm buying from the manufacturer. But again, I'm not telling you what I'm paying. I'm buying the drug from the manufacturer for, but I'm going to negotiate a price with you, third-party payer. And so they have contracts on both sides of the value chain.
Right.
And that's where the complicating factors of this come in. That is the behind the scenes stuff that you mentioned, the behind the curtain, that people want to know at a very basic level why their copay went up on a certain drug. And there's a lot of nuance in the contracting that went into getting you that drug at a certain copay. And maybe the contract got renegotiated. Mm-hmm. And that's why your copay went up.
Right. And it had nothing to do with the price of the drug.
Had nothing to do with the price of the drug.
But they're happy to let that fight play out in Congress and on the news every night. And the consumer sitting there watching the news saying, oh, that drug company, I can't believe they increased the price. And they didn't. It wasn't really, no, that does happen. We know that. But there's also their dynamic that your costs could be going up because the middleman decides they want to take more off the table.
Right. Yeah, it's a very complex system, and I think that's what people don't necessarily understand. And I tend to think it's like that in every industry, right? There's a whole lot more that goes into every industry than people really know, right? But in this case, it is playing out in a very public political forum. So it's very easy to kind of say, well, this shouldn't be that way. But I don't know that there's an immediate solution to fixing this.
No, I don't think there is. Talk a little bit about, because you're in a business dev role, talk a little bit about what you're seeing and what you think from sort of like a global perspective, where the market's going, where are we going with this industry? You know, we're here today with basic science and innovators and people that are like, they think they've got a good idea. Like, I got this little molecule, I think I can cure cancer. I don't know which cancer I can cure yet, but I think I can cure cancer, right? And we're helping them try to advance that to a point where they can someday cure cancer, right? And then this stuff we're talking about comes into play. But, you know, you've sort of seen this whole continuum, and you've lived it and you've worked within it. Where do you see it going, and where do you see as sort of some of the big things that are going to have to be addressed or corrected for? I don't know. You tell me how you want to answer the question. Yeah,
it's really interesting because I think, you know, there've been different kind of what I will say tipping points throughout the time that, you know, started as something like, hey, you're not sure how that's going to play out. And then it either doesn't play out or it becomes, you know, generally accepted that this is kind of how things work. I mean, I worked in the generic industry, right, for years, and there was a real big evolution there, right? In the beginning, branded companies did everything in their power, right, to give generics a bad rap. You don't want the generic, like it, you know, and so that was, I think, example of something that evolved into something that's generally very well accepted now, right? And when I look to kind of what I think the future is, I think COVID certainly, you know, you watch science and politics crash into each other like a car crash for that, right? Whether it was for the vaccine or for treatment or, you know, just kind of the medical situation. And I always say this, like, we were watching science play out in real time. And I think that was a big eye opener for people, in that science has a lot of uncertainty, and we're not really used to on a regular basis living with that much uncertainty. And so, you know, how big a role does politics play in the future of all of this, of what we're talking about, and how Medicare is administered, right? Of how, you know, how drug pricing is set, and, you know, what does the future of that look like? And I think on the scientific side, right, just, and it's so refreshing for me to come to something like this, to see the motivation and to talk about all of the ideas, because that's really that's what we all have to keep in mind in terms of what is the unmet medical need. And at its very core, it is about the patients, and it is about public health. And I think a lot of that gets lost in some of the narratives of today about, you know, everything that we see on the news about politics and drug pricing. And so to me, I'll be very interested to see how patient centricity and patient advocacy kind of evolves, especially now where information is so readily available to everybody, and
good and bad,
right. Good and bad but you know, how are patients being armed with information, right? How is AI going to impact decisions that are being made? That's a whole different use of data. When we talk about data-driven decisions, that's a whole different use of data than we're used to, that I don't think anybody knows the true power of, or how best to utilize that. You know, you could be talking about how patients are utilizing AI to make decisions or to get information, or you could be talking about, can we use AI to optimize clinical trial design? And what does that do to the industry? I mean, just the like, for me, that's like mind blowing on its own, right? You know, is there a way to do clinical trials faster?
The answer is yes. Yeah. It's just where and how do we deploy AI in a way that's relevant and adds value,
right
to the process, right? And it's easier said than done,
100%.
right? It's just, I mean, AI will transform, but not at the speed people think. There'll be a lot of hype around it. There'll be more hype, right?
Yeah.
There is now, but there'll be a lot of hype around what it's going to do and how fast it does it.
Yeah.
And we know like most data sets are messy, right? They're just messy. They're not clean and pristine. Because you have a data set doesn't mean that it's a good data set.
Yeah.
So it's messy. So my first thing is, can we use AI to clean the data? Just scrub it. And that's the first step for me, is get the data in a format that we can rely on the data, as opposed to just putting it together. Mm-hmm. Right now, most efforts are just integration of data.
Yeah.
Right. Not really thinking about the quality of the data. So that's number one for me, is use the AI to clean the data, to verify and validate that the data is accurately telling us what happened. Because you take a medical claims data set, okay? It does not reflect what happened to the patient.
Right.
It doesn't. The coding is done based on what the physician thinks they can get the highest reward for, the highest payment for. So they'll code things in ways that aren't reflecting exactly what was done to the patient, right? And you say, well, how about pharmacy benefit data? Same thing.
Right.
So you put those two data sets together and say, because I did this, I founded companies that integrated these data sets. And what we realized was, man, you got to scrub a ton. And then by disease states, it can be even more flawed, depending on the disease state and how the coding goes and what the costs are around the treatments. So, you've lived across enough therapeutic areas now where you know the challenges of all this. And then you look at a medical record. Medical record doesn't necessarily reflect everything that happened to the patient. Look at rheumatoid arthritis. Yeah. Most of the valuable information is in the notes. It's not in a field or a data field where you can easily extract it and analyze it. So that's why Crevitas was such a great company, because we were able to normalize a lot of that data that exists in those fields that you couldn't search or mine or analyze.
Right.
And so we elevated the quality of the data relative to the use of data. Mm-hmm. AI will help with that. Yeah. Quantum computing will help with that. Then once you do it, now you need people that can actually interpret it and make decisions. And they haven't been trained to do that yet, because they've never seen that kind of data.
Yeah.
So there's this whole evolution and knowledge base that has to be developed within our society that doesn't exist yet. So people saying, well, AI is just going to fix everything. Somebody at the end of the day is still going to have to make a decision on what that AI is telling us. Yeah.
And it's the input, right?
Yep.
The input has to be of quality for it to be able to provide quality outputs. So how does that play into it as well?
We don't live in, like you said, used the term before, managed care. Mm-hmm. It's not managed care. It's predominantly managed cost with elements of managed care.
Arguably, yeah. And that's why I think, like, I almost feel like and again, me talking, right? I almost feel like there has to be a correction back to the patient at some point, and what that looks like, I don't know.
Yeah. And it's not fair to say that the managed care companies are strictly doing it on cost, because if there is a therapy that is excessive cost for a moderate clinical benefit, that it may have an extraordinary benefit to a particular patient type, but not a universal benefit. They have to make a universal decision on how they administer that. So it's not like it's black or white. Right. I don't want people to walk away from this conversation thinking
it's fair point.
That it is far more complicated than they're making a decision strictly on quality of care or cost. Yeah. But they're weighing those two sides of the pendulum.
Of course.
Right. And they're trying to figure out how to develop policy that's administered over thousands, if not millions of people. Yeah. And so it's a complicated thing. And again, that's a place where AI could help to transform the thinking, where we say, if you present with these conditions and you have this particular type of cancer, you are getting that drug regardless of what it's going to cost us to provide it. Right. Because it's going to be 100% effective. Right. But then that doesn't mean it necessarily goes to, maybe that at least 25% of the population has that type of cancer. Yeah. They have the genetic factors that merit that. Right. Yeah, for sure. It's again back to the uncertainty, right? How do you solve for the uncertainties? But you're right. They're trying to put policy over areas that are extremely uncertain, and it doesn't. People slip through the cracks. Patients slip through the cracks. Yeah. So, hopefully, I look at it. We're both blessed.
Yeah.
Because we have a piece, we have some say in the game.
Yeah.
Right. We have some ability to affect this, right? The types of decisions that are made at your organization that you influence, to either take action to go forward on or to not. You're having an influence on this. Hopefully here by training people, you're having an influence here, exponential, by those people today. You think about this, it's Saturday.
Yeah.
We've been drilling them for 4 days. It's nonstop. It's tiring.
Yeah.
And they're asking you questions if it was the first session of the program on Wednesday.
When I came in, I said, how are you guys? Because I know it's a long program, and they were like, we're awesome. Like, they were so energized, and it's amazing. And you're right. It's really a big impact on what you're doing here for the future of the industry. It's
not me, it's we. It really is we, because, I do my little part in it, but it's the collective experience. I mean, I should sit down and sort of figure out what the combined experience was in just the faculty members. Because we don't have anybody here that hasn't been at this a lot.
That's
right?
a lot.
Right. You and I might be two of the younger ones.
Wow.
I mean,
okay.
Chuck,
yeah, true.
He was telling me, Chuck was here the other day, and he was telling me, like, his conversations with Moses back. But,
I mean, tell me said that.
Yeah. And Greg, I said the same thing to Greg. Greg said, yeah, because I was actually there when he was born. But,
that's great.
But, no, we have an extraordinary group of people that lend their time. We had a guy, so we have the investor panel tomorrow where where everybody pitches 10-minute pitch, 10-minute feedback, just like they're pitching to try to raise capital for their idea.
Yeah.
And we typically have 3 or 4 people in the panel. So one of the guys, his wife got sick yesterday, and he's like, I can't make it. But he said, look, I have a friend that is an investor who lives in the Cape. And I'm like, this guy's never going to come up from the Cape. The guy didn't even blink. He called me and he said, I'd love to come up.
That's awesome.
It is. Now, he is not doing that for me. He's doing it for the guy that couldn't make it.
Yeah.
Because they have a relationship and they've probably known each other forever. But I got on the phone with this guy. He was so nice. Like I'd known him forever, but that's just the strength of the network, right? It's not me. It's the network of people that, like, he picked up the phone. I said, I need you to help me with this thing. And the guy's like, where do I go and when?
That's awesome.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. And I think about going back to that positive state of emotion versus negative.
You've come full circle. Yeah.
Well, no,
we've come full circle in the conversation.
We're fortunate to have that in our lives.
Yeah.
Right. We're fortunate to be in presence of people that do that, because we hear about so much. So all we hear about is the negative.
Yeah. Right.
We hear predominantly negative. You turn on the news and there's very few happy stories, and there's just so much. I always say, as a parent, everything's working against you. It really is. You send your kids off to school, and there's just, between the social media and the, all the other agendas now that exist within society. I said something today. I used a term. I can't remember what it was. And Kyla scolded me and said, that term isn't acceptable anymore. And I said, well, what is? And she had to Google to find it. I said, no, that's an incorrect statement. For you to tell me that I used a term that's no longer acceptable. What was it? It was a term that's used in school. I have to think of this, because I said, if you have to Google an acceptable word, then it's not mainstream yet. Like, if you don't know what word to use and you have to find I have to look it up.
That's a high expectation on kids. It's a high expectation on kids. Yeah.
Because you can't converse anymore.
Right.
And they're already struggling to converse.
Yeah.
And now you're going to put a burden on them, like, please Google the phrase you're about to use to make sure it's considered acceptable.
Yeah.
And who's deciding whether it's acceptable?
Yeah.
Mrs. Google?
Mrs. Google.
Steph says it's Mrs. Google because she said there's no guy that smart.
Well, I'm going to start to use that.
It's Mrs. Google.
Mrs. Google.
Yeah, that's our little joke in the car when we're going somewhere. Ask Mrs. Google.
Okay.
Because guys aren't that smart.
Interesting. But.
So.
Yes, we are blessed. We are very blessed.
We both agree there's a lot that can be done. It's pretty exciting, I think, where we are right now and the opportunities that are in front of us and what we can do.
Yeah.
I thank
Absolutely.
you so much for being
Thanks
here.
for having me.
This is
always an extreme pleasure. IBE is always a great experience. And I feel like I get better at the podcast every time I do it. I get more comfortable.
Well, and you know what? It's funny to think back to I think back to when we first met, and you think like our relationship, our relationship has grown, and we've built it, and you've been so gracious in letting me come in and help you with teams, and it's just been wonderful. So thank you for being here. Thank you for your help, and take care of yourself.
Thanks.